September 1939. Paris is calm on the surface. Cafes are open. Newspapers sell steadily. Government buildings stand intact. To the outside world, France appears ready, armed, allied, and confident. Yet behind closed doors, a different reality dominates the conversations of ministers, bankers, and senior officials. France is nearly broke, not defeated, not occupied, but financially exposed in ways the public and its allies do not see. As Europe edges toward war, France presents itself as a pillar of stability. In truth, its economy is fragile, its currency strained, and its political system struggling to admit the scale of the problem. The question is not why France will later fall militarily. The real question is how France entered the war already weakened, and why it worked so hard to hide that weakness from the world. To understand this, we have to step back to the aftermath of the previous war. The First World War left France victorious, but scarred. Entire regions were destroyed. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. The human cost was immense, and the financial cost even greater. To survive the war, France had borrowed heavily, both at home and abroad. Those debts did not disappear with peace. Throughout the 1920 seconds, France tried to recover while balancing reconstruction, social pressure, and repayment obligations. At times, it succeeded. Industrial output returned. Confidence rose. The national currency stabilized for a while. But this stability was fragile, dependent on tight fiscal control and favorable international conditions. Then the global economy turned. The financial crises of the early 1930 seconds struck France later than some countries. But when they arrived, they hit deeply. Trade declined. Investment slowed. Tax revenues fell. Political divisions widened. Governments rose and fell with alarming frequency, each inheriting the same unsolved problems. By the mid-1930 seconds, France faced a dilemma with no easy answer. Military spending needed to rise. The international situation was deteriorating. Rearmament was no longer optional, but increased defense budgets collided with weak public finances, persistent deficits, and a currency that required constant protection. France could not afford both economic stability and full military preparedness without sacrifice. Instead of confronting this openly, successive governments chose another path: delay, disguise, and reassurance. Budgets were adjusted on paper, but structural problems remained. Short-term borrowing filled gaps. Financial maneuvers masked deficits. The appearance of solidity mattered especially to foreign allies and markets. Confidence became a policy goal in itself. The French currency, in particular, was a source of constant anxiety. Devaluation risked panic. Inflation threatened savings. Capital flight loomed whenever uncertainty grew. To maintain the image of strength, officials defended the currency aggressively, even as reserves thinned. Publicly, France spoke of resolve. Privately, it worried about liquidity. This matters because modern war is not fought on courage alone. It requires steady access to resources, fuel, steel, food, credit. A nation at war must spend continuously, often faster than it can earn. Without financial depth, endurance becomes impossible. By 1938 and early 1939, internal assessments were grim. Debt levels were high. Budget deficits were persistent. Confidence was brittle. Political paralysis slowed decisive reform. And yet, France continued to project readiness, both to deter adversaries and to reassure allies who depended on French stability. This is the first major turning point. France chooses image over admission. Rather than revealing the extent of its vulnerability, it presents a controlled narrative. Rearmament is progressing. Finances are manageable. The situation is under control. This is not a single lie. but a pattern of selective truth. Officials fear that honesty would trigger exactly what they cannot afford: capital flight, currency collapse, and loss of international confidence. Silence becomes strategy. By the summer of 1939, France enters a dangerous position. It is committed to confrontation, bound by alliances, and publicly confident, but economically, it lacks the margin of error required for prolonged war. This hidden weakness will shape everything that follows, because when war finally comes, France will not only be tested on the battlefield, it will be tested in its treasury, its banks, and its ability to sustain effort under pressure. And the world will soon discover that the strongest fortifications mean little when the foundations behind them are already cracking. Once war became unavoidable, France's financial strain could no longer be managed quietly. It had to be controlled carefully, deliberately, and above all, invisibly. By late 1939, the French state was spending at a pace it could not sustain for long. Mobilization costs rose immediately. Millions of men were called up, factories shifted to military production, and imports of fuel and raw materials increased sharply. All of this required money, vast amounts of it, long before any battlefield outcome was decided. The problem was not that France lacked wealth in absolute terms, it was that its finances were locked in the wrong places. Large portions of private savings were held cautiously, not circulating. Investors were nervous, capital was mobile, and quick to flee at the first sign of instability. The state needed to spend aggressively, but could not risk spooking the very markets it depended on. This forced the government into a delicate balancing act. On one side was the need to reassure the public and foreign partners that France was economically solid. On the other was the reality that emergency measures were already being used to keep the system functioning. Controls were introduced quietly, regulations tightened, information was managed. Currency stability became an obsession. The French currency was defended as a symbol of national credibility. Officials feared that any visible weakness would trigger panic not just at home, but internationally. A collapse in confidence would make borrowing impossible and imports prohibitively expensive. So the truth was softened. Official statements emphasized order and readiness. Budget shortfalls were explained as temporary. Extraordinary spending was framed as manageable. Behind the scenes, however, reserves were drawn down and emergency financing expanded. Foreign confidence mattered even more. France depended on continued access to overseas supplies. That meant maintaining the trust of international lenders and allied governments. Any hint that France was financially overstretched could weaken its diplomatic position at the very moment unity was essential. As a result, financial transparency became a liability. Decisions that might normally provoke public debate were taken quietly. Parliamentary oversight was reduced in the name of urgency. Complex financial instruments obscured the true scale of obligations. The appearance of solvency was preserved, even as the margin for error disappeared. This secrecy had consequences. By insulating the public from reality, the state limited its own room to maneuver. Difficult reforms were postponed. Structural weaknesses deepened. The political system, already fragmented, avoided confrontation with economic truth. Meanwhile, the costs of war continued to rise. Industry struggled to adapt quickly. Production targets slipped. Imports drained currency reserves faster than expected. The financial strain that had been hidden now intensified, even as official narratives remained unchanged. Pressure mounted from all sides. Military planners demanded more resources. Financial officials urged caution. Political leaders tried to hold the line between them, aware that admitting weakness could trigger exactly the collapse they feared. This tension produced a dangerous illusion. France appeared stable because it had not yet failed, but stability was being maintained through control rather than strength. Emergency measures replaced long-term planning. Confidence was manufactured, not earned. The gap between appearance and reality widened. Allies assumed France could endure. Markets assumed the state knew what it was doing. Citizens were told sacrifices would be limited. None of these assumptions rested on solid ground. By early 1940, the system was stretched thin. France was still standing. Its armies were deployed. Its currency held. Its government functioned. But beneath that surface, the financial foundations were eroding rapidly. This was the escalation phase, the moment when concealment became dependence. Because once a state relies on secrecy to function, it loses the ability to adapt openly. Every new problem must be hidden. Every delay must be explained away. Every warning becomes a threat to confidence. France had not collapsed, but it had trapped itself. And when the next shock arrived, there would be no room left to absorb it financially, politically, or psychologically. The lie had become structural, and structures built on denial rarely survive stress. The breaking point did not arrive with a single dramatic announcement. It arrived quietly through exhaustion. By the spring of 1940, France's financial system was no longer being managed. It was being held together. Emergency measures introduced months earlier had become permanent by default. Credit was stretched. Controls multiplied. Decision-making slowed as every choice risked exposing weakness. The state was still paying its bills, but only just. This is where the earlier deception turned inward. For years, officials had reassured markets, allies, and citizens that France's finances were under control. That reassurance now boxed them in. Admitting the truth, how limited the reserves were, how fragile confidence had become, was no longer possible without triggering the collapse they had spent years trying to prevent. So the illusion had to be maintained. Even as expenditures surged, the government hesitated to take the most drastic steps that wartime finance normally required. Large-scale restructuring of debt was delayed. Forced mobilization of private savings was avoided or softened. Full transparency was postponed again and again. The result was paralysis at the worst possible moment. Military planners assumed resources would be there when needed. Industrial managers waited for clear direction that never fully came. Financial officials warned privately that the system was approaching its limits, but those warnings could not be acted on publicly. France entered the decisive phase of the war without financial flexibility. When pressure increased, the system had nowhere to bend. Capital controls tightened further, but too late to restore confidence. Currency defenses continued, but reserves were insufficient to sustain prolonged strain. Imports became harder to finance. Coordination between financial and military priorities broke down. This was the real collapse, not of armies, not of territory, but of capacity. France could still fight briefly. It could still resist. But it could not sustain uncertainty. Its economy had been tuned for stability, not shock. And shock is what modern war delivers. Who benefited from this situation was not a foreign enemy alone. The greatest cost was paid internally. By hiding the depth of the crisis, the state denied itself the chance to prepare society for hardship. Citizens were not mobilized economically in time. Political divisions were left unresolved. Trust between institutions eroded when reality could no longer be disguised. When failure came, it appeared sudden, almost inexplicable. In truth, it had been accumulating for years. The deception had not been malicious. It had been defensive. Officials believed that confidence was the only thing keeping the system alive. And for a time, they were right. But confidence without capacity is temporary. France's financial weakness did not cause military defeat on its own, but it shaped the environment in which decisions were made. It limited options. It slowed responses. It magnified every shock. And when the system finally gave way, it did so completely. Those who had argued for realism were proven right too late. Those who had relied on reassurance lost credibility overnight. The state that had tried to protect itself through silence found itself exposed when silence could no longer be maintained. This is the central betrayal of the period. Not that France lied to the world, but that it eventually believed its own lie. By the time the truth became undeniable, the opportunity to correct course had passed. The financial collapse did not announce itself with numbers or charts. It announced itself through helplessness, and helplessness, once revealed, spreads faster than panic. The final phase would not be about concealment. It would be about consequences. When the illusion finally collapsed, there was nothing left to hide behind. France's financial weakness did not vanish with the end of fighting. It followed the country into defeat, occupation, and reckoning. What had been concealed in 1939 became undeniable in 1940, and irreversible in the years that followed. The state that had tried to preserve confidence at all costs now faced the consequences of having delayed truth. The most immediate outcome was loss of control. With finances exhausted and institutions discredited, France no longer shaped its own economic destiny. Decisions about currency, production, and allocation were no longer made freely. What had once been managed quietly was now dictated by circumstance. The deeper impact, however, was psychological. For years, citizens had been told that France was prepared, stable, resilient. When reality broke through that narrative, trust shattered. The gap between what had been promised and what was experienced created a sense of betrayal that lingered long after the crisis itself. This mattered because national endurance depends on belief. Economic sacrifice can be sustained when people understand why it is necessary. It collapses when hardship arrives without explanation. France's leadership had feared panic if the truth were revealed. Instead, panic arrived later, stronger, sharper, and harder to contain. In the long term, the episode reshaped how France approached power. After the war, economic policy was no longer based on appearances. The memory of hidden weakness haunted decision-makers. Financial transparency became a priority, not out of idealism, but out of necessity. The cost of denial had been proven too high. Internationally, the lesson was equally clear. Allies learned that military strength could not be separated from economic depth. Appearances mattered, but they were not enough. Credibility built on silence was fragile. Once broken, it could not be easily repaired. France rebuilt again, this time under very different conditions. But the story of 1939 remained a warning embedded in institutional memory. It demonstrated how easily states confuse confidence with capacity, how tempting it is to protect stability by hiding vulnerability, and how dangerous that choice becomes under pressure. This is why the story matters beyond its moment. Modern power is not only about armies or alliances. It is about resilience, financial, political, and psychological. A state that cannot sustain truth cannot sustain crisis. France was not unique in facing economic fragility before war. Many nations do. What made this case decisive was the choice to deny rather than confront it. The lie was not a single statement. It was a strategy that worked briefly and then failed completely. By the time France could no longer maintain the illusion, it had already lost the ability to adapt. The cost was not just defeat, but disorientation, a nation discovering too late that the ground beneath it had been hollow. The final lesson is quiet, but enduring. Strength that depends on silence is weakness in disguise. And when the moment of truth arrives, silence offers no protection at all.